Alright, population time. Let's take a look at where we are. So we've studied ecology, the interaction between organisms with each other and with their environment, both biotic and abiotic. And when we look at our study of ecology as a whole, we have all these different levels to it. At the top there's the biosphere, which would be the whole Earth, everything that's alive on the Earth and all of the things that are within it. We can break the biosphere down into biomes, and we'll study those in a little bit. Ecosystems, just mentioned. Communities, we've done a little bit of. Food webs, there's certainly a study of communities, but within the community we need to look at the level of population. And populations are, as you remember, have been defined as all the members of a particular species living in a particular area. That area can change in terms of its size and boundaries. It's a little bit of an artificial construct, but the important thing to know is that populations are dynamic, and what we need to know is how and why do they change. So what is the structure of a population? How is it that we know what a population is made up of? Why does it change? And so how does the environment have an impact on that? Now, in terms of our population growth, there's theory and there's reality. We'll of course start with theory and then go just a little bit today into the reality of real life, real world populations. But to start with the theory, first of all, remember those four main factors, two ways organisms enter a population: birth and immigration. So when new organisms are born and when organisms move into the area that is bounded by the population, we would say the population increases. So here's our birds in the middle. Baby birds are born, those are new members of the population. Or when other birds fly in, then they join the population. On the other side of that, when there is death, whether it's a natural cause, natural disaster, predator, doesn't matter. If it's death, then it leaves the population. And then emigration, when it leaves to go to a new place. So those four factors, and remember the letters: B for birth, I for immigration, D for death, and E for emigration. Now, when we look at the theory of population growth, in a hypothetical situation, we could see populations increasing exponentially. If you imagine here on the right, here's the bacteria. Starting with a single bacteria, every 20 minutes, a bacteria is capable of undergoing cellular replication. And when it replicates, it creates a new bacteria. So, in essence, it's reproducing. So if we start with one bacteria, 20 minutes later we would have two bacteria. Each of those two would then divide 20 minutes later to make a total of 4 bacteria. Each of those would reproduce to produce 8 bacteria. That's just 1 hour later. And then 1 hour and 20 minutes later we'd end up with 16 bacteria, and that would continue on and on and on. And when we look at the way the mathematical representation for this type of growth is exponential. And so the idea of an exponent, and here's a curve showing this exponential growth of the population, time on the x-axis, population on the y-axis. So as you move forward in time, the population, the doubling of the population continues and continues, and so that graph gets steeper and steeper until it can become a nearly vertical line, showing that the population in very short periods of time is increasing really, really rapidly. So exponential growth, obviously that doesn't really happen other than very small time periods and very specific circumstances. Because ultimately what happens is that for one reason or another, there's going to be a limit to the total size of a population. So the population will grow and grow and grow, and that's in the exponential growth phase. At some point there's a transition and the population growth slows down, and then eventually will plateau and will stop increasing entirely and will just become level over time in terms of the population size. When it reaches that plateau stage, we call that the carrying capacity, and that's going to be the limit to how large the population can get in the environment. So, question to ask yourself, and might be helpful to pause here: what can limit the total size of a population? I'll give you one example and then take a chance to think. Food. That's an obvious case. Your food source will limit the total size that the population can grow. If there's plenty of food, then the organisms will reproduce and the population will grow. But once there's no longer enough food to go around, there's going to be more deaths and there's going to be more emigration out of the area, and so the population will then begin to plateau. What other factors could possibly cause that? Looking ahead just a little bit further, to mathematically represent it, we can look at the plateau phase here at the top as the number of immigrants and the number of births. Okay, remember that birth rate can be represented by the word natality, so n. So I plus n, the number of immigrants plus birth rate, is going to be equal to the number of immigrants and the mortality rate. So when those things are equal to each other, the population remains stable. It's not going up or down. If the number of immigrants and births are greater, represented in both of these first two segments, in those cases then population is going to increase. And that's true in the exponential and transition phase, that there's going to be either more immigrants, more births, or some combination. Now, to switch back over to a little bit of reality. So let's look at the structure of populations. So the first thing we need to think about is how is the populations are going to be measured. One very common way of measuring animals, particularly those animals that are small in total population size or large in body size or just a little bit rare, is to be able to do mark and recapture. The mark and recapture method, you're finding individuals, you will capture them, like the spotted owl shown here. When they're captured, you put some type of signal on them. It could be something as simple as a band with a number on it. In some cases they might have a radio transmitter, or they might have some type of tracking chip that can be, will send out signals to satellites to be able to monitor in real time where it is that organism is. Those will be released, and then there's a continuous process of recapturing the members of the same species, and then the scientists will be able to compare the number of tagged individuals to the number of untagged individuals that are caught to be able to make an estimate of what the total population size is, because they'll be able to set up a simple proportion, and since they know what the number of tagged individuals are, they can mathematically estimate the total size of the population. Again, this could be used for, going to be used for animals, things that are mobile, and it takes quite a bit of effort, so it's going to usually be limited just to those things that, for some reason or another, we have a high interest in knowing the population of them. So endangered species is a great place to start. In a method for sampling plants or very small organisms, or one that organisms that are going to be confined to a smaller geographic area, we can use the quadrat method. And this should be familiar from your population study. So in the quadrat method, we're looking at plants or small animals or animals that don't move very much. And in this case, we might be comparing different species within the same area, or we might be looking at two different areas that have the same species. So two important concepts. First, samples within a chosen site must be randomly selected. So the best way to do that is if this green area represents your test area, to make a grid. And then use something like dice or a random number generator to be able to select random numbers on both the y and the x-axis, and then you would physically move to that spot in that area and do a count within that area using something like a square or circular sample size area. So you need to be able to do enough of those, you need enough total samples in order to make it statistically significant. And so this is where a little bit of math comes in. The more samples that you take, the more likely it is that you can actually get an answer to the question, which in this case is some comparison between areas or species. Now, when we study populations, we tend to see three different patterns as we look at them. In the clumped pattern, we see that there's going to be this as you see here, the starfish would be clumped because of behavioral reasons, because of pragmatic reasons like a food source. They are going to be together all in one spot, and then there's going to be large open areas where there are no members of that particular species. In this pattern, you see that these are all spaced at very even, very deliberate intervals. In this case, each penguin has a certain amount of area that it wants to have to itself while it's nesting, and so they're all going to maintain those spots at a safe distance from one another. And when you plot this out on a graph, you'll see that all of those intervals are pretty even, and so you see this very nicely spaced out population. Trees would be another example of where you could see that occurring. And then random. You look at the dandelions here in this field, and you see that you can have a smattering of trees, a smattering of different grasses, all growing throughout the field, and it's fairly random, based on wherever it is that the seeds happen to grow. Finally, I'm going to end here with one final idea of something that we study about population, and that is survivorship. Survivorship, as we look at 3 different populations here, shows how the age, or the total lifespan of the individuals in that population compared to the percentage of members of that species. So if we look down here, well, let's look first at the humans, number 1. So if we look at the maximum lifespan, so over here on the right, this is as long as a human could theoretically live, and we look at the number of survivors. Well, what tends to happen is that of all of the births that there are of humans, there are very few deaths, and then once you get into middle age and then into old age, there's a very steep drop-off. So the majority of humans that are born tend to live full lives. If we look at average lifespan in America being around 80 years, or in the mid-70s to 80 years, and we know that the maximum lifespan of a human is only a little bit over 100 years, and so the average human is living a full life into old age, and then there's a rapid die-off of the population at that point. If we look at smaller animals, we see that most of them are not living to old age. Most of them are not dying of natural causes because they reach their maximum lifespan, but all throughout they're dying of hunger, they're being eaten by predators, there are natural disasters, and so both that death rate is going to be higher no matter if they are young or old. And then we look at the mussel or clam here, and we see that of those that are born, very few of them actually survive to adulthood. And so of those that do survive, in that early period, then they're the ones that are then living into old age. But again, the conditions of wherever it is that those individuals were born is limiting how many of them can actually, in this case, attach to a rock where there's plenty of water and plenty of food and good resources and not too many predators. The number of them that die off before that point is very high. So we'll pick up with a little more on population in our next screencast.